Welcome back to Studio C70. It is still Election Day. Polls are still open in the city of Philadelphia and across the state of Pennsylvania. Polls are open until 8 o'clock. If you are in line by 8, you're allowed to vote. It is still gorgeous outside. If you haven't cast that ballot yet, if you're still in the office, go ahead and take off, because this is a big election here in Philadelphia in particular. Not only do we have judicial offices on the ballot, but a whole slew of city offices from mayor and city council on down. Do get out there again, just a little bit more time to vote, and polls do close at 8. We have been live all day here at Studio C70 at the Committee of 70, speaking with folks about the election. So we're closing out today with an extra special guest, Dr. Jessie Fields from New York City. Dr. Fields,
glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on down. So,
Great.
so the special treat here is that Dr. Fields is a longtime board member and advocate with Open Primaries, which is an advocacy organization based in New York City, and which supports primary reform across the United States.
Yes.
And I think what's particularly exciting is that we have some activity here in Pennsylvania that is relatively new, and I think there may be an opportunity to actually get a little bit of primary reform in our state.
Right.
And you're a born and raised Philadelphian.
Yes,
so you're back home.
I grew up in Philadelphia. I went to medical school, Medical College of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Bryn Mawr College before medical school. I did my residency at the medical college. I had a scholarship that paid for my medical education, which is the only way that I would have left Philadelphia. I had to because they gave me a placement in Chicago. So I spent about 5 years in Chicago, worked on the west side of Chicago, and actually met the movement for independent politics and political reform while I was working as a doctor on the west side of Chicago. But I'm glad to be in Philadelphia today on primary day. Very important day.
We're still looking to steal you back. If we can't get you back full time, we'll pull you back here from New York.
Absolutely.
As often
Come
as
and
possible.
visit as much as I can.
Take you over to Harrisburg as well. So actually, can we start there? So Philadelphia and Philadelphia and Harrisburg in some ways, but Philadelphia and Chicago in particular are cities that have a lot in common, post-industrial cities, but also our politics I think are somewhat similar. It's just similar cultures, kind of individualistic, very transactional in a way that out west is not quite the case, and as a result, we have some challenges that other parts of the country don't have. So can you talk about your experience in Chicago in particular, and how that kind of led you towards independent politics and the way our primaries work?
Sure. I grew up in South Philly primarily, and also West Philly, and really the black underground sub-economy in the black community. My family was involved in that, and I was determined to try and make a difference by becoming a physician. So my education was paid for through scholarship, and then that's how I had to pay back a year for every year that the National Health Service Corps had paid for my medical training, and that's why I went to Chicago to fulfill that scholarship obligation. While I was there, I had finished my medical training. I wanted to go out in the community and make a difference. I thought of talking to people about health and what to do about high blood pressure and diabetes. And I found that I was working at the Martin Luther King Health Center on the west side, poor black community, and the community had been burnt down during the riots after Dr. King's assassination, and they had built this clinic as kind of a sort of a Band-Aid. The clinic was in the middle of a field, and I wanted to really make a difference, and I felt like I had to go out to the community and talk about health, because sometimes patients couldn't get to me because they were so poor they couldn't afford transportation, and sometimes I visited patients in their homes, and I realized that I had to go outside the walls of the clinic to really make a difference, and I got involved. I went to New York and started doing health work. I met Dr. Lenore Fulani, who had run for president, ended up running for president as an independent, and Dr. Susan Masad, a physician, and they were, particularly Dr. Masad was doing a lot of community health work. I started getting involved and was doing that in Chicago. I ended up running for office as an independent in Chicago, and kind of from there, I really wanted to help the community to grow and develop and to be healthier, and it seemed, I sort of discovered that there were many, many issues that were determined by failed public policy in which people in the community were not participating at all. And so I was looking for ways to involve people in growing and changing the political process. And eventually I ran as an independent, and then when I finished my scholarship obligation, I moved to New York so I could work more closely with the political reform and independent movement.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning, and then of course I got more and more involved in politics and kind of understood those relationships better.
So I can't imagine running as an independent in Chicago is any easier than it is in running as an independent in Philly or New York
or New York,
or a lot,
right.
I mean, a lot of these kind of cities. So what was that like?
Well, my campaigns were grassroots campaigns. And I ran for Congress in Harlem against Charlie Rangel. The campaigns were never about winning. There was no possibility running as a grassroots candidate and as an independent that I was going to win, but I was challenging the hegemony and the domination of the Democratic Party on poor communities and communities of color and the black community in particular. So I took that message out in talking to people about the relationship between political disenfranchisement and poor health. And I ran as a doctor, not a politician. And it was exciting. I loved it. I met a lot of people. I got to talk to people. I felt that part of my responsibility was to inspire people to participate, to make a difference, even though I was not going to win the election. And I was very honest about that. And so, I really, it was hard work. I put, a lot of energy into it. I continued to practice. I assured my patients that I wasn't going to be leaving. I wasn't going to win the election. I would be back in the office the next day after the election.
Something a lot of folks don't realize when you're running for office, in most cases everywhere across the country, you got a day job. It's really only a few folks who get to run full time.
Just run full time. Yeah.
Okay, so you wound up in New York, and you've been working with the Open Primaries advocacy organization for how long now?
I've been supporting Open Primaries since I've been in New York for a long time, and I ran on a platform of political reform, term limits, open primaries, same-day voter registration, etc. So Open Primaries was an offshoot of independent voting, and like 5 years old. So I've been with Open Primaries from the beginning, since it started. And John Updike, who's the founder and president, asked me to be on the board. I was thrilled to say yes and to participate, and then have become a national spokesperson for Open Primaries, and I've spoken at different conferences on political reform and independent politics around the country, and begun doing some writing, op-eds primarily. But we're growing, as you know, and there's, besides in Pennsylvania, there are other states where there are efforts to change the closed primaries and open up the primaries. And so it's very exciting. This is a very, very interesting time. There's a lot of growth in the reform movement. My question to that is, like, what would you attribute this interest in primary reform to? So, and I'll name Pennsylvania because that's where we live and work. There have been, John Updike has noted this, that there's been kind of like a startling amount of interest in Pennsylvania in primary reform without there being a whole lot of kind of like outside advocacy efforts. It's just sort of happened organically.
Like editorial boards, elected officials here and there, both sides of the aisle. There are some there are independent like activists who have been pushing this on this for a while, but the idea is just kind of like percolated in a way on its own, and it seems like as you know, like in other states across the country, this seems to be kind of a growing conversation.
Right.
Some states are more successful in actually getting legislation passed than others, but like, why do you think in parts of the country and many parts of the country are we talking more about the way our primaries work?
I think it's a very interesting and important question, and more. I think it has to do with the growth of independent voters. It really wouldn't be an issue if everybody was registered as a Democrat or Republican and voted in their party primaries. It's become, I think there are many reasons. One of them is that there's been a steady increase in the numbers of people, voters, who decide not to be affiliated with the Democratic or Republican parties. And so that's been one phenomenon. And those voters, even though they can't vote in the primary in many states, such as Pennsylvania and Florida and New York, New Mexico, et cetera, they still choose to be independent. And so, Pew has followed that steady increase. It's increased over the last 10, 15 years and has never gone down. It's been very persistent and is growing. It's now between 40 and 45%. So what people are saying in that. And I think there are many people who are registered Democrats and Republicans who feel similarly but don't leave the parties because they won't be able to vote in the primary.
Yeah.
But people feel that politics has failed, that it's corrupt. They see the dysfunction, the partisanship, and so many, are becoming independents. And part of the I think the movement and growth in the support and advocacy for open primaries is that people don't really feel that the government is representing a nonpartisan interest, that the government can really function on behalf of improving public policy. I mean, there's so many examples of that. Healthcare is one of them. The recent crises in the Boeing issue, the issue of the lack of separation between business and what's supposed to be safety. The FDA is supposed to be, or the Federal Aviation Administration is supposed to be working to keep people safe, but in fact, Boeing seems to have had an undue amount of influence on that. That's just one example. There's so many examples of the lack of nonpartisanship, and I think people are very concerned about that, and so they want to make a difference. Part of it also, I think people see that the two parties have been able to guarantee re-election of their incumbents again and again. It's the case in New York, certainly, probably similar in Pennsylvania, where incumbents 90, 95, 98% of the time, they get re-elected. Part of that is because the primary is closed. Only a small percentage of people vote in the primary. As soon as they get on the ballot, in a Democrat or Republican dominated, whichever party dominates the district because of gerrymandering, they win. And that has been a very erosive problem of corruption, and it's very anti-democratic. So for all of these reasons, which I think are related, people have, there's been greater interest and momentum around opening the primaries.
Yeah, I something else you've seen in Poland is not just the number of self-identified independents, but the number of folks who are disenchanted with government. Just kind of generically, government. These polls can be directed at local and state, or local versus federal. But at federal in particular, there's a tremendous lack of trust. It's just, and that's been decreasing actually for years.
Right.
How much of this, so you also just mentioned gerrymandering, right? When political boundaries are drawn in a way to manipulate the process to give an advantage to some group or someone over another. Can you talk a little bit about how redistricting reform and primary reform are kind of interrelated? I mean, they in some ways they try to get at similar problems. I mean, the lack of competition is not the only kind of issue that comes up with gerrymandering. There are a number of others, but I think this is something else that folks don't need to realize is that some of the issues that we attribute to gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, could be addressed, maybe not entirely, but certainly at least partially with primary reform, open primaries.
Yeah, I think that primary reform is really critical because it allows more people to participate. It's empowering the voters. Nonpartisan, independent redistricting is great, and in fact, I just had the opportunity to speak with Katie Fahey, who led the effort in Michigan, and that was such a wonderful victory. I think both are very much needed. Primary reform, it seems to me, as I see it, is critical because it's not just a matter of evening the playing field between Democrats and Republicans and increasing competition, but also allowing for voters to have greater power, a greater say, greater importance and recognition, including for independent voters, and also having a way for voters to, for people, just ordinary communities, to break through the divisions that the two parties have benefited from and have promoted and, manipulate people around, and including racial divisions, economic divisions, class divisions, and one of the missions that I consider very important in my own life is bringing people together, people of all ages. I work with a youth program, and we help young people from poor communities to grow and develop and bring them together with business leaders and philanthropists, which is very, very exciting work. So I think opening the primaries, having people be able to vote together, you're able to build coalitions across these divides, across partisan divides, which I think is critical. People can come together and put aside their differences and actually build something together. So if we can change the voting process, if we can reform our elections, it's a way of empowering people to create something new together. Can we, and this is America, this is supposed to be the capital of democracy in the world. You know, that's our claim to fame, democracy. But our democracy is failing. It's fundamentally failing the people of the country. So can we all come together, you know, at different levels, at the city level, citywide, statewide, nationally, to impact on that? I think that's the most critical issue affecting the country right now, and needs to be addressed. And it's not just opening the primary in kind of a technical way. I think there's a qualitative and humanistic effort, you know, really. I mean, I think of Dr. King's beloved community, you know, being able to really impact on people's lives and the quality of their lives, and having different people just having conversations together who are not usually allowed to be in the same room together. That's part of the mission of political reform, and I think of opening the primaries as well.
Yeah, just because I'm really curious. So you know, you've been in New York City for a while, and whether it's New York City, Chicago, Philly, again, probably a whole series of post-industrial cities that have somewhat similar politics, but then also election systems. I mean, in these older states, our laws are just literally older. So in Pennsylvania, our election code goes back to, and our close primaries go back to at least 1937. And actually, at that time, were reform. I mean, but back in the day, it was a bunch of men in a smoke-filled room, closed, the old smoke-filled room, making all the decisions completely out of daylight. And having a closed primary system where actually party members get to vote was a big improvement. Obviously, like a lot has changed since 1937. But again, like these other cities and these other states in the general like Mid-Atlantic region, at least the Rust Belt, have similar challenges. So like in New York City, I mean, what are folks talking about? I mean, is it the way the way elections are run in New York, the endorsement process that the political clubs engage in, term limits, what kind of stuff is? Because I feel like I see bits and pieces of the same debates and the same discussion happening in New York, even though New York's a lot bigger than Philly is.
Yeah. The New York is very partisan and controlled. It's really difficult to open up the political process in New York. More and more people are just turned off and are not voting. I mean, the turnout in the last mayoral primary was like, I don't know, 19% or something. It was 18% in Pennsylvania. It was a similar. Very low. So, people are not participating. They're not voting. And in New York, it's the Democratic Party that dominates. And so, but I think that there is interest, and every year, for example, in the summer, we do a lot of grassroots work in New York. And one of the examples of that is every summer we go out to Harlem Week. I practice medicine in Harlem, and I've run for office there, as I mentioned. And the support for reform, for fairness in our elections, for opening the primaries, for giving independents the right to vote is enormous. Almost everybody you talk to, even people who are registered Democrats, think it's unfair. So there's no lack of that kind of support. But how do you get that through the partisan establishment? How do you translate that into legislation? Now, we did elect Mayor Bloomberg, Mike Bloomberg, who became an independent. He was elected mayor 2001. He won by virtue of the independent votes that he got. I ran for the first time I ran for office in a really big campaign was when he ran for mayor. I ran for Manhattan Borough President. I came in second from the Democrat.
Which that's a major
I
office.
know, because I wasn't.
We don't have borough presidents here, but that's a big office just for the folks at home. I mean, the boroughs are
the boroughs are
the size of Philly.
Are large. So he was someone who supported primary reform, nonpartisan elections. We were able to put it on the ballot, and there was a huge backlash. I mean, it was just a huge campaign against us. And we weren't able to overcome the unions.
From like
and
the establishment political interests. Okay.
Yes, exactly. The parties, particularly the Democratic Party, and they out and out, told falsehoods. They claimed that if open primaries was passed, that the people of color who had been elected from communities in Harlem and Brooklyn and the Bronx would no longer be in office. That they would, and that this was just a ploy by a rich white man, basically, which was not true. And in fact, other people would be elected, not the same people who stay in office again and again. And I think it would be empowering. And in fact, the facts are that open primaries has been positive in electing more people of color in California, in Chicago. That's an open primary system, and other places. The facts, support open primaries in that regard for more diversity in our elected officials. So I think I might have gotten away from, in terms of comparing New York. Yeah. It's particularly difficult because New York is very sophisticated and entrenched. It's not that there isn't popular support for reform. In fact, there is. But the levers of power are such that it's very difficult to open up the process. Even with reformers, they tend to just, this is how it is, this is how things are controlled in New York. It will happen, I'm convinced. We will open up the process in New York. It just may take longer. So in most places, open primaries is on the ballot once and it doesn't win, maybe twice, maybe the third, like in California. It was in 2010 that the initiative was on the ballot. We don't really have statewide initiative and referendum in New York State. That's one of the problems.
Nor in Pennsylvania. All these old states.
So this makes it a little bit more difficult. The places where it has been passed, like in Colorado and California, has been through initiative. It hasn't come from the state legislature. Now maybe we can change that here in Pennsylvania. It would be great to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll have a shot there.
I think we do. I think we do.
As you know, there is legislation in the General Assembly, Senate Bill 300, which is the prime sponsor of which is Senator Joe Scarnati, a very powerful politician, who actually has a kind of interesting political history. A lot of folks may not realize he won office narrowly as an independent. The first time he ran. The first time he ran. And I think his reasons that he's put forward for supporting this is that he sees political polarization not just in the electorate but in the representatives that the electorate puts in office, and I think it's become more and more difficult. At least he's speaking. He's seen his caucus. Maybe he sees the other thing in the Democratic caucus as well. It's harder to get certain things done when folks are being pulled farther to the left and right. So there's also House Bill 192 in the other chamber. Representative Chris Quinn has introduced that. So we'll just have to see.
Great.
Yeah, just have to see.
Yeah, I think his concern. I read an article, and he also mentioned the fact that turnout was so low. And so I think those are genuine concerns, and they can't get things done. There's no way to compromise, and so I think that's a very good issue to put it forth on.
I think it's just getting some more oxygen and some more energy than it's had in the past. So.
Which is great.
I think we'll have to have you back down.
Great. I'd love to. I mean, I was here today out on the street talking to people, and I think we have to do more of that kind of grassroots organizing, get the populace interested, let them know what's happening, that there's this bill that is possibility for opening up the process, and we had a lot of support out there today. I think we can make a difference.
Mainstream this issue a little bit.
Exactly.
So, Dr. Fields, thank you so much for coming by while you're in town.
Thank you.
Because this legislation is out there, and I think more people are talking about this, I think we'll count on having you back in Philly.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back.
We'll talk about this and provide a status update on where this legislation is.
Terrific. Thank you.
All righty. So we are signing off at Studio C70. It is Election Day, Tuesday, May 21st. Big election for the city of Philadelphia. The results will be coming in. PhiladelphiaVotes.com is the city's election website. From there, you'll be able to link to the live unofficial results for the city of Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania Department of State will have the live unofficial results for the statewide offices. That'd be the judicial office on the ballot, Superior Court. So thanks so much. Again, if you haven't voted, get out to the polls, and we'll see you on the next election here at Studio C70. Thanks a lot, Dr. Fields.
My pleasure.
See you next time.
Thank you.